Welcome everyone to what is our fifth and second to last session on our study of Moses as an example for all of us in the modern day of both a brilliant leader, but also a reluctant prophet, and how he steps into his identity, his leadership, his faith is very instructive for us as we look a little closer. And I hope that's what we've discovered so far. But today we're going to look at this sort of period of time, which is post sort of the actual Exodus. And, we covered the 10 Commandments, but post Exodus, and then all this time that they spend, the story tells us it's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, from the time when they cross the Sea of Reeds to when they're they go over, actually fairly quickly, they end up at the base of Sinai and they stay there for 11 months. And then they're wandering around again to where eventually Moses dies on Mount Nebo, which is only miles from the promised land. So that's what we're kind of going to look at today. The path that they took, we talked about this a little bit last week, but just to reiterate, the path that they took was not the shortest path. They could have gotten to where they were going in about a month had they just gone the shortest path along the Mediterranean Sea. But in the story, it talked about how they didn't want to do that. God didn't want to have them do that because they might come into conflict with the Philistines, who were their mortal enemy at the time. And in their weakened kind of, or just fledgling state, God didn't want them to be afraid and run back to Egypt. So that's what this sort of circuitous route is representative of. What we'll find today is, as they were wandering, they found this need to create what they came to call the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle. And it was this sort of portable worship space that they created to honor God. And what's interesting about that, we'll get into some of the details about that, but what's interesting about that is there from Exodus chapter 25 to 40, is all about the construction of that tent of meeting and how you furnish it. And it's quite interesting, since there's way more attention to that detail than to even the discussion of the 10 plagues, the Exodus itself, the crossing of the sea, all of that. It's not even close. And I just wanted to just put it out there, not only just to mention that, but why do you think that is? Any ideas as to why there would be so much time spent on this tent of meeting? Why is that so crucial? It's okay. You got to think about it for a second. And think about also, when was this written down? Remember we talked about when this story was actually written down? It was in a very unique time in the history of Israel that these stories were actually written down. They were oral up until then. They were written in the Babylonian exile. So how might that relate? Why so much emphasis on this creation of a tent of meeting, which is quite a religious, it's a religious space. It'd be like designing our sanctuary. The story of the Exodus is so much about that. Why do you think? Kathleen?
Well, maybe it could help them have this sense of belonging to something that wasn't just transient, and just all these details, could make them really feel like there's a solid foundation. I don't know if that's exactly, but since there wasn't really, as they're wandering around, I just think that it might have had a good feeling.
I think you're right on it. It has to do with belonging, it has to do with identity. It has to do with what's possible when life is transient and you are wandering, or when you're not in your homeland, okay? When you're in a place like exile. How do we be who we are in a space where it's hard to put down roots? Or as the by the Rivers of Babylon song goes, how do we sing King Alpha's song in a strange land? The creation of a tent of meeting is a very specific way that I think accomplishes just what you said, because it is odd, isn't it? It's a way of establishing roots or creating a foundation in very unstable circumstances. It's portable, it's somewhat simplified, and yet it's very specific. And there's spaces in there that are designed for certain things that are very like sort of liturgical and important. So it's an important space. And that's one of the things we'll talk about is just what is it about sacred spaces that feels important? And how does that creation of the tent of meeting maybe correspond to the way we have sacred space today and the types of spaces we create and that inspire us? So we'll continue to play with that. But here's the other thing I wanted to say before I finish up this intro. It's the people find their way to a place that is mere miles from the promised land within 2 years. They are there. And so what happens is they get a couple scouts, Caleb and Joshua, and they go out and they scout it out and they say, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. It's the land flowing with milk and honey, but there are also fortified cities. Okay. And because the people kind of, they get nervous and they're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't go in. They are made to stay there in that location, mere miles from the promised land, for 38 years. 38 years, that's the whole. And now I think admittedly, the 40 years is quite a symbolic number, 40 being a time of completion, okay? When it's done, it means that we've moved from one place to another in our sense of identity, our sense of direction, our sense of purpose. But so much of the time is spent right there on the cusp. Oh, they almost can touch it. Okay, so that's important. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the way the passages we're reading today, we'll talk about how they talk. There's an image or a vision of shared leadership and what leadership looks like. That we'll get into a little bit. I think it's instructive for us in our individual lives and in our church lives. And then also we're going to look at sort of the impact of complaining and fear. And I don't want to, and when I say complaining, you know, I don't mean to just poo-poo complaining. I want to look at what complaining does, what it represents, you know, because the people, we're not going to read every instance of complaint, but trust me, there are like 15 of them where they're just complaining. And usually, you know, you could probably remember what it's about. Complaining about the food, complaining about the accommodations, complaining about the relative lack of safety, okay, that they're experiencing out in this wilderness time. So we'll get into that too. And through all of that, we'll continually reflect on how we might respond to God's Spirit through these stories, you know, how it impacts our own life. What's our own sense of our lives as we consider what the wilderness wanderings looked like for the people of Israel, of ancient Israel. So that's kind of the overarching introduction for today. Do you have any questions, places of reflection, or even comments based on previous material that you'd like to share before we get into the readings? No? Okay. Then let's, if I could get 2 volunteers to help with reading, we'll go and we'll just jump right into those the 2 readings for today. The first one is pretty short. The second one is medium long. Carol, you'll do the first one? Okay. And thank you, Kathleen. All right. There we go.
And all the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, "Let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt."
Nice. That one's it's a succinct kind of description of their complaint, and it kind of covers a lot of bases there. So that's a good example of what their complaint looked like. And now Kathleen.
Exodus 18, 13 through 27. The next day, Moses sat as judge for the people, while the people stood around him from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known to them the statutes and instructions of God." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You should represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. Teach them the statutes and the instructions, and make known to them the way they are to go and the things they are to do. You should also look for able men among all the people, men who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Set them as officers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, tens. Let them sit as judges for all the people at all times. Let them bring every important case to you, but decide every minor case themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their homes in peace." So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men from all Israel and appointed them as heads over the people, as officers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And they judged the people at all times. Hard cases they brought to Moses, but any minor cases they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went off to his own country.
Thank you. Wonderful. I love that second reading, and we will get into that more specifically. But as we think about the way we connect to some of the ideas of this wandering in the wilderness, just in your own mind, maybe in your own life, what does it mean to be in the wilderness? And I'm not talking about going hiking or camping here. I'm talking about if you've experienced those places of spiritual wilderness or maybe emotional wilderness, what does that look like for you? What has constituted that? Has it been something that you caused, or maybe that happened to you? Just think about, and if you'd like, talk about what is a wilderness? What has been a wilderness for you? What's your experience of wilderness? When I was, before I got married, I was engaged twice. And the first time I broke it off because it was clearly not the best fit for us, as I sort of stepped into becoming a minister and she was going in a different direction. But the second time I was engaged, my fiance broke it off. And for a while, I just thought I wasn't cut out to love one person. I felt like as a minister, I was trained to love and lead on a broad level with a bunch of people, but I just felt like I'd never get to that place where I could really love another person. And I think that wilderness for me has been something that has been a journey. It's not, even though I've been married now for 11 years, it's still there inside me, that idea or that understanding of myself, that I wonder how, if I'll ever fully be able to step into loving, with my full self, one other person, as opposed to, and that balance for me. That's been a place of wilderness for me. Anyone else? Anything come up? I'll go with Margaret and then Kathleen.
Well, just excuse me, please. I can hear you, but I'm going to lay down for a while. But I can hear you.
Oh, wonderful.
And thank
Well, we will
goodness
include you as best we can. And thank you for making it work in whatever ways you need.
Well, I'll be back, but I just got to lay down for a while.
Thanks, Margaret. Kathleen, I saw your hand up too.
Well, I think that I feel in a wilderness with the chaos of the world, with it's a real lack of understanding, with war and political directions. And I feel like for me, that is a wilderness because I don't see how it's going to end. I just see us maneuvering through. And
Yeah.
so that, to me, that's a daily wilderness that I find I am in.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I know a lot of us can relate to that. Right now, it feels like things are so frayed and even fractured that it's hard sometimes to feel like we have a shared vision or a shared destination as a country. Sometimes maybe as a community on a smaller level, we can still feel that, but it does feel so like we're wandering around right now and wandering through some difficult times. And it is really, I think it's a profound wilderness experience that a lot of us are feeling in our country with all the things that have happened, the war outside, the conflict within, COVID, so many things, economic downturn. So yeah, thank you. Any other examples, any other ways that you understand wilderness or that you've experienced it? Or even how you got through it, how you found your way through? Yes, Peter.
I think that word conflict is kind of key to being in the wilderness. Conflicted, looking for, I went through a period of looking for myself, looking for a home, looking for what was the right fit, looking for, trying a lot of things and never being totally satisfied with any of them. And so I think wilderness has come up frequently, or they can for me. And certainly for 40 years, I did wander in the wilderness. And it was fun, but it wasn't fulfilling in the way that I knew it could be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's how I understand it.
Yeah. So then in hindsight, as you've looked back on what you describe as wilderness, do you feel like you've come through it, or how does it still connect to your life now? And do you look back in those ways, like you said, they're the most fulfilling, and yet do you have a different perspective on them now that you're where you are now? Like, how does that wilderness still sort of impact you today?
Well, personally, I'm glad I went through the wilderness, and I'm still going through the wilderness in some senses, like Kathleen mentions. It influences me today in that I have a greater recognition of what I call home. I know that my own home resides in relationships and being true to myself, and putting kindness and service and relationships before selfish things.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's this, it's a growth, and growth, I think, we can't get to where we are or to where we will be without going through what we need to, what happens. And so sometimes we want to compartmentalize the things we experience. And I think it's what I'm hearing in Pete. It's like, you know what? It's all connected. It's not like it's over. It's not discrete. It's just, it's there, and it's a learning sort of place for me, and it continues to be so. And I don't want to dismiss it, but I also am not living there fully. I'm here now. So it's just, yeah, it's kind of hopeful in a sense to go through the places of wilderness, assuming we've found our way through. And that's where, I think we also know there are types of wilderness in our lives where we get stuck, and it's difficult to get through, whether on our own or with a group. And so that's a common type of wilderness too. Some of you may be feeling in one right now. To understand that, to look at these places, I think helps for us to appreciate what the wilderness experience of the Israelites were, because it's not just about the freedom from Israel. It's about all the other human experiences. I'm sorry, freedom from Egypt. It's about all the other human experiences that lead up to the creation of something new. To actually leave slavery and move into freedom is a scary proposition. Okay. And that's what it's about. That's the general picture. So in our own ways, we're all doing that. We're all feeling a sense of relationship to both that, slavery and freedom. So our awareness of that, I think, helps us to step more fully into some of the meaning of these stories. As we continue to hold that, let me try this little angle. How about, what's your relationship with complaining in your life? Have you found there have been seasons of complaint? What is the role of complaint? Do you tend to look down upon complainers? Do you find yourself complaining a lot? Do you use it as a tool? There's a lot of ways we can look at complaint. I want to find out, what's your relationship? What's your understanding in your life of complaint? Marcia?
You can complain, but then do something. So it's always got to have the post of that is you've got to do something. And when I hear people complaining, it's like, what are you going to do about it? Well, I can't do anything about it. It's like, well, if you can't, maybe find another place to make everything okay. If we don't have, it's like I can complain about the government, but there's certain aspects of the government I can't do anything about. So does it do me any good to complain? Mm-hmm. So I let it go.
Yeah. So in that sense, complaint is an opportunity to be honest and open, and then to, in your sense, to invite a certain accountability to not stay stuck there. This whole idea of wandering in the wilderness, one of the operative words is the wandering, that there's movement. There is movement, just as you're saying, that's suggested. So complaint it may be quite a valuable tool, or it can be, so long as we don't get stuck in the cycle of complaint. And it's not to say that there's always a linear fashion. Don't get me wrong. I think we know that it's not always very linear. Well, okay, I'll just do a little complaining here, and then I'll work through it, and I'll go to the next thing to complain about. It doesn't usually work like that. But complaint, our relationship to complaint is that it can be a very powerful tool, an important tool. Any other reflections on complaint?
You want me to bring it in here?
Marilyn.
actually, your use of tool was just what I was thinking. that I think for me, it's a wonderful way to recognize where I need to do something. And that maybe until I complain, I've kind of been ignoring it, or
Yes.
as best I could. But when I realize I'm complaining, then I want to know, okay, Marilyn, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about this?
Yeah.
And then that means that the complaining was kind of a tool to bring my attention to where there's some place in my life that I need to do something about it. And if it turns out that I'm complaining about somebody else, well, then what I can do about that is to become more understanding, to try to figure out better where the person's coming from,
Yeah.
why these things are happening. And anyway, yeah, I love the word tool in this particular setting.
Really hear what's being shared so far, folks, because it is, complaining is a source of kind of like opening up of accountability, even if it's just to ourselves. Because if we don't complain, and if we stuff it, you know, sometimes we're complaining on the inside, and you know what I mean, but the act of complaint is to let it out and sort of have it external so that it can be assessed. Again, a little bit of accountability there. So it invites us to then, okay, now what next? In my life, the way I was raised and what I value, I've always sort of wagged a finger at people who complain. It's just kind of, and so that's been a struggle for me, you know, to not react to the people who complain is just like, oh, you know, complaining, you know, that just, in my life, over the course of my life, it's been a lot of that more negative. But what I've learned as an adult and what I'm stepping into is that more, what both of you have said, that tool approach to complaint, that trusting that when we put out there what's really what we're feeling, what we're bumping into, it trusts the people around us. It leads to a certain accountability, and it kind of moves against. And what I realized is when I don't complain, I give off the air that I can handle it all myself, and then I got it all together. And that may or may not be true, but it operates in that sort of sealed off bubble that is quite different than the way of existence that I think we all find that we thrive in. And that is, we can't do it ourselves. It's kind of the passage we read that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, says to him, you can't do it all yourself. But I find that complaint can be quite a valuable entry point to that shared way of being. It's funny. That's kind of one of the places of learning that kind of connects to what you both said, but that's something I've noticed in myself about complaint. Any other, Carol?
You just summed up everything I've been thinking. And Jay and I have a joke. I'm the incurable optimist, and he's the incurable pessimist. His job is to keep me from getting too high, and my job is to keep him from getting too low so we can have a straight and narrow path together.
And it's sometimes not very straight. Sometimes it goes like this, but that balancing, you know, that's so important. And I do find that in our long-term relationships, be they our spouses or that special friend or maybe sibling, when you can operate that way and value each other's perspectives, you know, that sometimes, you know, one person's Tigger and one person's Eeyore. But if you know the story of Pooh's Corner and all that, they're deep friends. It can work, but sometimes, you know, it takes that perspective to appreciate what you're bringing to the table when you have your particular perspective. But also saying, you know what, to call each other to accountability is very important. And, you know, so to say, look, I'm tired of your complaining. That's a complaint, you know, that kind of thing. But it also offers it in a way that can be then shared and moves it forward. So that's what I'm finding is that that complaint isn't really that much of a problem unless it's stuffed, or if it's either stuffed or we get stuck in it. Otherwise, complaint is quite valuable and biblical. I mean, the whole book of Jeremiah is complaint. A lot of the Psalms are complaint. It's spiritual. And you know, the act of complaint is a deep trust. I think it's a faithful trust in God, because God doesn't desert us when we complain. God helps us find a way through it, you know, and God appreciates whatever communication, whatever connection, whatever we have to offer, and might call us out to accountability. But that relationship, that's the gold. That connection, that investment in us, that's the gold right there. And that's what we see, these patterns of complaint met by Moses and God trying to figure out how to best meet the needs of the people. Sometimes frustrated, sometimes angry, but always with a spirit of love and hope and movement and future. Any other thoughts or comments about this, the idea of complaint? I think it really can help us get a different perspective on what we see, because, you know, we often laugh at this story, you know, they're just freed from Egypt and within a chapter, they're already complaining, you know, but I think there's something more to it than just the act of complaint. It's more the movement and the shaping of a people, you know, how it happens. Anyone else? Margaret?
I think it's great that Moses accepted his father-in-law's advice. So many, I mean, I for one, don't accept advice very good. I always figure I can do it and I'm not going to bother anybody else.
Yeah.
But when Moses got down to it, it went more smoothly. He reached out more people. And I think that's great.
Yeah, it's true. It's a profound move for him because we see in the story that he does accept the advice of his father-in-law, and it does shift the way, the dynamics that have been created. And we'll, you know, let's look at that, because it's important. Let's go back to that Exodus 18 and let's just see how that conversation with Moses' father-in-law, because it really emerges out of this place of complaint from the people. And they literally want to go back and choose another leader. That's what it says in that Numbers passage that Carol read. You know, so it's like they want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so Moses is just like, what the? And so that's where this conversation really opens things up. And there's a lot of wisdom here. So let's look at it again and see what kind of principles about shared leadership are actually mentioned in this passage here, this conversation. What are some things that you notice that kind of become the, I guess, operating, you know, some principles here that Moses uses and the people will move forward with? Some shared leadership descriptions.
Well, some things were minor and somebody else could handle that. He didn't need to be bothered with it.
Yeah, so set up people and set up systems that allow for like a tier system or whatever. Equip people. So that means you need to train them well, but to handle the small fires and then to bring the more serious things and to know what those are, to discern, to bring the more important things to Moses, but to really create a system of shared authority. And to do that, you have to equip them. Yes, that's a good one. What else do you notice? What are the things that seem to be specific? Marcia?
One thing that,
I'm sorry, and I you know what? Go ahead, Kathleen, because I just can't see everyone. So do in this case, just go ahead and feel free to talk. So let's do Kathleen, and then I saw Marcia.
well, one thing that's just hitting me in the situation, I find myself right now, it says, what you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone.
Yeah.
And that's hard for me. I'm dealing with my sister so much, and it's like, whoa, I cannot do this alone. And luckily, just for all of you to know, Jane Worth's sister-in-law is really a help with my sister.
That's wonderful. And to come to that place can be quite humbling. And sometimes we have to be brought to our knees to realize that. But sometimes it's just through the loving counsel of another person who sees our lives and our patterns a little bit more clearly than we do. So the act of listening, that Margaret pointed out, that you're mentioning now, Kathleen, just listening to someone who presents that perspective is a huge step towards this idea of shared leadership. I think, who was the other one? Was it Marcia? Thank you.
Along with that is, I don't see Moses complaining, but he's playing kind of the martyr. Like saying, I have to do this, and I'm called to do this. And I think so many times I for one, I won't complain, but it's like, oh, I've got so much work to do, but I've got to do that because I'm called to do that. And
yes. And we thought, we probably all know those people who, whether because of lack of complaint or just the sense of duty, they can fall into this kind of martyr complex. And Moses doesn't, I don't know that he falls into a martyr complex here, because it is a very funny interaction that I think we can all relate to, where Moses is like, look, God, you got to take these. Why did you give me these people? They are incorrigible. You let me this. Why do you treat your servant this way? In fact, if it's gonna keep going like this, please just kill me, is what Moses says to God. And I believe that's somewhere later in Numbers. And it's just like this idea that we can all relate to. It's just like, I can't do it myself. But that's kind of his kind of owning up to the same kind of thing that his father-in-law is talking about in a lot of ways. And it's when we are humbled, when we are brought to our knees, a lot of times, that we realize, all right, I need to stop taking it all on. It is too heavy for any one person. So what are some other ideas about specific things that his father-in-law suggests? Let's see, I think it's mostly all up in this upper section here, that that relate to how he will share leadership. Marilyn?
I'm impressed by what he says about how to carefully pick the people. So you don't just, okay, you, and you, and you, or let's count 1 to 5, and every 5th person will, or something, that it be very carefully done.
Yes.
So that then he can feel confident about the responsibility that he has asked people to assume. And I particularly like the one, let's see where it is, hate dishonest gain.
Yes, right.
I don't know, that's just hitting me so because of so much of what we're seeing right now, it seems
people
to me.
Of integrity, people of reverence, people who are trustworthy. These are the ones who are well equipped to be our leaders. And these are qualities that are so important that when we notice the lack of them, we see how it fractures our everything. It tears the fabric of our society, because if we can't trust those people who are in positions of leadership, then it really just means a lot gets potentially thrown out the window. So that is incredibly important. And that's sort of the first thing. Choose people well. Do your best to be discerning about them. Train them well. Equip them to do what you're asking them to do. That sort of thing. And then and be public about it. Let the people know these are the ones that you will report to now. This idea. It's just the way he says it. It's like common sense, and yet it's really liberating. And, I feel like in our own church, I'm just going to come back to all of you here. I wonder, what your experience is of the leadership structure in our church, and how does it correlate or not, in your experience, to this advice that Jethro is giving to Moses? How does your own experience in our church relate? Margaret, and then Carol.
Well, I haven't been to church for a while, but one time, I don't think you were there. We had you were probably on your Sabbath, but anyway, they eliminated at the beginning of the service of turning around and saying, greeting your neighbor. And people really enjoyed that. And somebody decided, no, we're not going to do that. I really was disappointed. No, I should say stronger than disappointed. But anyway, you come back to it and we enjoy it. I mean, I did, but that was an experience that, well, maybe there's something to this change of ritual.
Yeah, and I think that's it. And what we've seen is in the 10 years I've been with the church, we've changed a lot of things with the service and with our attempt to reverently express our worship and to live into that. And we've tried new things, we've gone back to old things. And I think the way we do that is we try it often, and then we see how people respond. And so in that sense, complaint is really important, or feedback, we'll call it, because it could be constructive. It doesn't always, or positive. It doesn't always need to be complaint, but just that is how we tend to navigate some of these areas. And so in that sense, the way we do our worship, it really is a shared vision, even though it can be a little slow. It's difficult to make it work. We still are going through some of the pushback about how when we let's see, it was 4 or 5 months ago when I pulled back from inviting individual prayer concerns just coming from the congregation. And some people really appreciate that because it keeps things a little tighter, but some people really miss it. They miss the opportunity to share what's happening in their life. That's just one example. And so, we're constantly reevaluating how all these pieces fit together towards a common goal of what feels like connected and meaningful worship. That's what it comes down to. So it's trying to figure that balance, because what is true for one is not always true for the others. But the process is the same. It's like, well,
I really miss coming to church and seeing what you're doing wrong.
Yes. Well, I know one thing: we don't sing "How Great Thou Art" is enough. How great thou art enough.
Do you?
Come back and we'll do it. Thank you for that, Margaret. Any other comments? I think Carol had her hand up, and then Marilyn, did you still have something you wanted to add, Carol?
I just wanted to know, how did this structure, how far back does it go of having boards and the churches divvying up the responsibility? I mean, how far back was that? When the first church, did they do the same thing? Did they divvy up the responsibility?
Yeah. And in fact, when Jesus, in passages like this today, and in passages like in Acts, and when Jesus sends out the disciples and kind of tasks them with specific duties for teaching, for healing, for doing different tasks, it naturally kind of flows, at least in our church tradition, to the expression of what we call boards, really task forces or groups of people who are focused and trained, have a level of awareness of operating within a certain realm, not exclusively, but really that's an area of increasing proficiency that allows then the work of the church to be done. So the board structure of our church is an attempt to live into the very things we're reading about today, that it's not all on one person. But what's interesting is a lot of us were raised in churches where, and I remember interviewing, and you can tell when a church kind of has this, some churches think that, okay, we call a minister, and that minister is the job of that minister is to be the face of the church in the community and to do the work of the church in the community. And that's not wrong. But if it's not balanced well, it can be a burnout path, obviously. It can lead us down the very same dynamic that's a part of that Exodus 18 passage, that Moses can't do it all himself, But some churches it just depending on their experience, and some of us, depending on how we were raised and where, it's more or less shared. Now, sometimes it's the structures can be there and the minister isn't always the best at delegating or creating. And, that might be there's always room for growth there. I know that's something I long to do. And I think as we're kind of emerging out of this time of COVID, it's important to kind of get back together and say, all right, how are we doing? Now let's look forward and create a vision. Let's create this vision of what's the next promised land, that we want to move toward. So we're not just wandering around in the wilderness like we feel like we have been for the last 2 years. And some of that's important. Some of it gives us the life teaching we need that's akin to what Pete was talking about. It's not always the most fulfilling. It may not be what we think is our ultimate goal, but it's a teacher, and it's important because it helps focus us for where we are now and where we might go, as long as we don't just stay stuck. So anyway, these are a lot of the things that they're coming up for me in relation to this kind of evaluation of shared leadership. Any other impressions or thoughts about that? Just the examples of leadership in our church, how it connects, Marilyn? Oh, you know what, Marilyn, whatever you want to say is fine.
Okay, I was going to go back to the Moses situation, because one of the things that you did when you set this all up for us to talk about was to ask what we could learn about leadership from looking at what happened here, because it worked. It wasn't that the father-in-law gave him a bunch of advice and then he didn't follow any of it. It really worked. And I think that wasn't accidental. I think that there was some wonderful structure in the advice that was given with the goal of helping Moses, with the goal of helping him be able to share this responsibility so that he wouldn't get so tired and all of that. And I think that's an important thing to be thinking about if we're ever in the position of giving advice, that we don't just say, you got to do less. You just got to do less. Bye.
Yeah.
That we have thought through what we would really want, the kind of advice we really would like to give, depending on the goal.
Yeah.
And sometimes that does definitely mean just saying, I'm thinking of times when I gave advice to my daughters about some kind of really difficult situation they were having with a child. And sometimes I would be very specific on what I thought would work. And sometimes I wouldn't be. I'd say, this child a lot better than I do. So you go ahead and figure it out. And depending on the situation, both of those approaches worked. And an awful lot of times, my daughters did listen to my advice. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. And that comes out of a relationship, of trust when you give, because advice is not a one-way street. It is that sort of deep listening that allows you sometimes to say less or maybe a little more, depending on the circumstance. And I think that continues to deepen the relationship, which leads to the possibility that down the road, they'll come back when other complaints or concerns or anything arises where they need. So I think that's crucial. And anyway, it's a blessing when we can create these types of dynamics that allow for the sharing of wisdom, essentially. Ken, and then was it Pete? Did you have your hand up too, Pete? I saw another hand flashing. Okay, so Ken first.
One of the things I note about the advice was that the responsibility of Moses and the leaders that he chose was to take their cases before God. And I think when we've been church at our best is when the leadership of the church is seeking to discern God's will in a particular situation rather than just fixing it ourselves.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. That we try to not fall into the idolatry of our own capabilities, that it's important to recognize the capabilities and the strengths that we have as a community, but ultimately to have at least some team or some leader that's aware of that broader vision and that can kind of hold us to accountability when it needs to be said or done, so that we don't fall into the places of maybe fear or convenience in terms of how we often maybe handle situations or make decisions. And I do think that's always important, because as a church, sometimes, you got to call on that vision, especially if there's times of not, struggling to agree. Think back to some of the difficult decisions that you've been a part of in your church experience. Maybe not at this church, but maybe for some of you it was. But when churches like ours go through the open and affirming conversation and how we welcome and love people as they are versus others that have different perspectives, and there's a little less kind of toleration. And that can be very challenging. And sometimes what happens, and good leadership will allow for conversation to happen, but then call us to that sort of higher direction where we may not agree, but we can, on certain levels, but then we can affirm something that pulls us in that higher, larger direction, and hopefully trust that, because that's, we will often fall into traps or pits or challenges when it comes to making these decisions on our own. So to really have a sense of clarity and look to that sort of higher power, higher perspective can be incredibly valuable. It doesn't make it all simple. It doesn't mean it's all gone, but it gives us a sense of how to function in the midst of disagreement. And that's, to me, that's one of the most crucial aspects of living in community. Peter.
I think that Jethro's words to Moses were not just meant to relieve him of this burden that might do him in, but really to create relationships, and by creating a kind of a less formal power structure that people among the Israelites were empowered, and relationships grew as a result of going to someone other than Moses and relying on their wisdom. And that, as with our church, the boards serve a similar purpose.
Yeah.
That they bring people together in an autonomous way to make a decision or recommendation that is empowering and relationship building.
Yeah, I think that's so important to recognize that it is about relationship building. It's about community decision making, as opposed to what is often a pattern in churches, even modern churches, where the priests are so relied upon for their expertise and for their wisdom. And sometimes we have this sort of guru or expert mentality that we just go to that singular person and we just take what they say, a little bit like the Pope. I don't want to overstate this, because I do think there's so much wisdom that comes through even a structure like that. But a reliance on experts or one singular person or voice can also, it can take the responsibility away from us. And what Peter's describing, what Jethro's conversation describes, is a totally different vision. It's much more democratic, much more relational. And that is something that I think, as we see Jesus in his teaching and his way of expressing God, and the way of healthy, whole human interaction and relationship, it's much more about that shared vision, not trying to make it all about one person. But what's interesting to note is we see that throughout the scriptures, into Old and New Testament, we see this constantly coming up. So we know it's a crucial issue. Heck, if you read the history of the church, throughout the, theology, that this issue of who do we rely on? How do we create good structures for making healthy decisions? It comes up all the time throughout history. So it remains a very significant area of concern for the church as it goes forward. And it's a matter of deciding and discerning where we fit in, what's the most sustainable, life-giving path. And I think, these types of passages describe that, but we then are tasked with actually living into it. And that's where the rub is, because at different times we do it well, or in different places we do it well, and then in others, maybe not so well. So it's a learning process, and learning to take away the shame and say, don't worry about that. Let's just operate together. Let's figure it out together. Structures like this, I think, encourage that. Any other comments about just, your own impressions of how we're doing it in this church, or just in churches in general? How is what's your experience of leadership, shared or otherwise? Do you think it's healthy? Do you think it's working? Or any other comments about this particular passage? Marcia?
So don't null and void my membership, what I have to say.
Oh, don't worry about that.
Well, and I love the structure. When you go, you are so anointed, and you feed your flock, and it's amazing. I feel so uplifted when I come to church, and it just feels so warm and home. And I know it's a lot of the people, but you are an amazing leader. When you're gone, I notice this dearth of, it's really hard that you're not there. So I've given it much thought, and I thought, but there are anointed people here. Maybe they can't do all your job, but maybe there's people who really have a great communication with prayer. Maybe somebody tells great stories. Maybe somebody, singing. All the parts that make up a service, that when you're gone, you have people that are anointed in these different areas that, I feel like the father-in-law could take over. So the service is of many people, but trying to replicate you is impossible for one person, but having a lot of people.
Right. And thank you for saying that. And your membership is on solid ground for now. But no, it's just because it's important to look at this. And you know what the hardest thing for me is? I don't get to see how it actually goes, because I set up the people to come in there, but I'm not there. So I get feedback, and I try to do that. I try to put people in place to have who are gifted with sort of leading different things in different portions of the service, whether it's the sermon, whether it's the prayer time. But it's important to get the feedback and sort of say, hey, what's working? I asked Scott Bond last time because I've done twice now where I've recorded the sermon. So it's still me, but I did it on the screen. And I got what he said was very positive feedback, but I don't know that that's everybody. And would people rather have it like that, even though it's a video? It's still recent, it's me, it's all that, but would they rather have that, or would they rather have a live different voice? It's not easy to kind of figure it out. It's kind of a trial and error thing. But I guess where we live into the pattern of what Jethro and Moses are talking about is that at least we then get the feedback and have the conversation, and my decisions will be very much impacted by that, because all my effort is to try to create a meaningful worship experience every Sunday, to try to set up the possibility for that happening. And so if there's ways that can be enhanced, then yeah, I want to do that. But it is hard because I don't get to see some of what you're describing. But that's a very good example. And it's one way, because it's a central one. Worship is central in our life together. It's the foundation. It's the foundation upon which all the other stuff, all the other work is built. It's where we create relationship. It's where we create the reverence. It's where we connect to the divine, and in some ways, in meaningful ways, to each other in that worship space. So, not sure how to, like, the conversations that could emerge from this are probably beyond the scope of what we would want to do in a class like this, but it's important to keep it going. So maybe that's where others, so Marcia, we could continue this conversation, afterwards, just to see, what are some ways to consider moving through this that are helpful. I'd like to shift to this idea that we see in the wilderness wanderings of creating this tent of meeting. And in a sense, the sacred space that is described, that we didn't read about, but I'll show you a picture of it. But it's meant to serve as both a worship, like a sanctuary, and also it's meant to be sort of like a palace. And here's what I mean. This is sort of, this tent of meeting is sort of a modern rendering, but it's faithful to the ideas presented in Exodus and Numbers, where there's this, sort of, it's set off by some sort of a rudimentary type fence. It's got this gathering area out here. This is one of the holy areas, and inside the tent is the Holy of Holies. So it's really set up to be a place of reverence, but also a place that's designed to illustrate sort of the power, the royal power of God, even in a setting where they're nomadic. Okay, so this is not, the temple later functions like that, where it's when they have a land and that can be built, it becomes much more rooted, but it's the same sort of basic structure, when you look at the spaces that are created. And so as we think about this, I just want to ask you to think about, historically, it was the churches that were the spaces that could communicate, both welcoming in so that you could connect with the divine, but also spaces that were absolutely ornate and beautiful that communicated some of the power and majesty of God. Okay, they were inspiring in that way. And that a lot of that's changed now. And so I want to ask you, in your own modern sense, what are the architectural styles? What are the buildings? What are the places that seem to communicate, that are the most meaningful and inspiring these days? And what does that say about us as a culture? So what are some architectural styles that you consider to be, in the modern times, the places of inspiration, the places of most beauty? Bonnie?
I have to say that a few years ago, I was in Los Angeles for Easter, and I went to a service, and it was one of the, I guess they got this big tent thing. It was one of these mega church with the TV screens, big screens all over the place, and the praise worship up on the platform and all of that, and a huge crowd. And that didn't do much for me. I guess I'm old fashioned and I'm traditional. I like being in a church, and going to something that sort of resembles a rock concert or something is not my thing. Now, maybe it's works for other people. I really like the fact that we're in a church. I like the fact that we have a choir. My husband's the same way. We've gone to churches where there was no choir, and it's like that didn't seem like it was church for us. That's really important to me. But I'm in my 70s. People in their 20s probably feel very differently.
It's true.
So it's kind of nice to have the mix, because I don't want to go to church where everybody's in their 70s. I think it's important that we look at at younger generations and what works for them. And they haven't grown up like we grew up going to a church. And so they have different viewpoints. And I think it's important that we try to reach that as well, but it's really nice to have a blend. It's nice that we go to church and sometimes we have traditional hymns and sometimes we're singing out of a Hallelujah songbook and things are more modern. And it's, well, I've never heard that song before, but that's good. You know, I like the blend, the mixture, but but I'm really glad that we're in a church and not in an auditorium somewhere.
And that's true. Thank you for that. Our church is designed architecturally to be a beautiful space, to be a welcoming space, but it's not what I would describe to be an ornate space. It's not like the cathedrals of Europe or some of these other places that are so stunning in their majesty, in the height of their ceilings. And all of that was done to kind of convey the power, the majesty, the royal, divinity of God. So that was what, churches were made that way. Ours has some, I think, inspiring aspects to it, but they're subtle. Just the fact that when you walk in those sanctuary doors, the floor drops and the ceiling raises. And so I've talked about this in some settings, maybe counsel or whatever, but the experience of walking towards the cross means that your world is expanding. It expands your world. And as you walk into that sanctuary, the whole sanctuary expands and it gets deeper and it gets broader and taller. So there's a real message that's communicated there. Now, like I said, it's subtle. You may not be thinking of that. It's not going to blow you away like walking into a cathedral and seeing the gold foil or the Sistine Chapel or that necessarily. But there is still a beauty. There's still a story there. But where I'm also going with this is like, so what then, if not the churches, because I think in general, a lot of churches these days are functioning, in less ornate spaces. But what are some of the buildings that still have that sort of the majesty or whatever that we seem to focus our energy on and making opulent and kind of royal, majesty? Can you think of those buildings or those places that now reflect that? And then the next one is like, okay, and what does that say about about values maybe in our culture or just some shifting? Like, what are some of the buildings that are designed like that these days?
Are you talking about the United States? And
sure, but worldwide,
present?
but just in your experience, what are the buildings that seem to have that?
Cathedrals in Europe, to me.
Yeah, but cathedrals in Europe really function now as museums, mostly. That's the crazy thing. They really are more tourist things, that people come to, and less about the actual functioning as worship. So I think that's one of the places. Museums in general tend to be the design of museums. It's just majestic and beautiful and opulent. Those can be, like that. What are some other ones that you can think of? Other styles of buildings that seem to just be like, wow, that is designed with something bigger than just the simple structure and the simplicity of just functional. Carol? And then Ken?
As you were talking about how many times or the few times I've gone to someone's house and the thing is just massive. I mean, it's like it's something out of a magazine. And then you come home to your little house and there's a comfort level here. Mm-hmm. If I spill something, it's okay. In that house, I don't know. Anyway, that was just the way the feeling is the same for me.
Yes, it absolutely can be, because a lot of times we can get ourselves into that place of wanting to, whether we compare ourselves or we see that and we think, wow, that's wonderful. But the truth is, we will fill whatever space we have. And sometimes that can be its own, it can be a real burden to do that. And the truth is, we're always, for our homes, you're not wanting to live in a museum. Typically, you want to live in something that feels like a home that you can live in, because that's what a home's for. But those places that tend to be more ornate these days are not so much our churches. And maybe they're our homes, but they're the museums. Oh my gosh, the performing arts centers, they're gorgeous. That one in Sacramento is just beautiful. There are some office buildings that are so remarkable, and the way they have these glass structures and the way it's designed and built. Heck, even the Transamerica building in San Francisco, which is not a new building, but it was a dramatic, beautiful building. And it's just to say that as we move through different periods of our story, of our history, the structures communicate some of the things that we value, okay? And some of the shifting of that. And I don't say that to say that one is good and one is bad, but it represents a shift. It represents a shifting in the way in what we're communicating in the things that we think are going to lead us through the wilderness or into those places of promised land. And I think in this country, business is one of those places that we've looked at as somewhat of a saving grace, or we put a lot of energy into the cultivation of business, of commerce, of creation, of jobs like that. So office buildings, they kind of reflect that. Pay attention, see what you notice about the buildings that are the most beautiful, sometimes governmental buildings, you know. The ones that are beautiful often are really rooted, you know, they're the ones that kind of represent the foundations of who we are. Pay attention to that and see what comes up. See what you notice about how these types of buildings communicate what we think is sort of essential in our community, in our functioning as a community. Any other comments about that, Bonnie? Oh, sorry. I want to call on Ken because Ken had his hand up previously, and then Bonnie.
I'm working on a class for Sierra College on the greatest libraries of the world.
Oh.
And there are amazing library buildings. One of them is the National Library in Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress. It's a spectacular building.
Yeah.
And it's the largest library in the world.
Yes, exactly. That's a wonderful example. You know, that has been, I mean, Alexandria was known for that in the early days of the church, which was just this place of learning, and the libraries that they had were just stunning. And it's a symbol of what we value, of what's some of the things that are important. And yes, libraries are often quite beautiful structures, but also quite homey structures. You know, it's really interesting, the dynamic. I remember when I went to Trinity College for a year, they have this library called the Long Room, which is very much kind of like a museum library. And you had the Book of Kells and these ancient, beautiful volumes that were just they're hand painted and stuff. But yet there were still these really comfy chairs set off to the corner here and there. And that. So it was an interesting combination of design and of opulence and of majesty, and something you come in to appreciate and see almost like a tourist, but also designed to have you hunker down for a little bit and actually get your fingers into some of these other volumes. So libraries often can communicate both those things. See what other buildings come up. See what other ways these places of inspiration and of beauty can function in our society. What they say about us, where these places of meeting, you know, what they say, what they invite us to, how welcome do we feel? It's really good to notice that, because design is all around us, and that's the intention of it, is to make us feel a response to a space. And the more we pay attention to that in our regular world, the more I think we'll be sensitive to it in the places like home or our worship spaces, where we notice, wow, I hadn't seen it like that before. I've pointed out to some of you, again, and I apologize if it's repetitive, but when you look at the stained glass at the front, on the, I think I'll get this right, on the left side, it is a pattern. And on the right side, like there's a pattern for the colors. And on the right side, it's just chaotic. Okay. And it's designed that way on purpose. I could have gotten that wrong. It might be swapped. But the point is, where they meet at the cross, it brings together the order and the chaos of life in the stained glass. It sort of but it's just something symbolic that we readily could miss unless we're tuned into how space creates these opportunities for connection. Okay, so that's kind of an invitation to notice what are the types of tents of meeting that we find that we've created in our world, and how do they invite us into a deeper experience of our life, a connection to something meaningful, inspiring, even to the divine. Was there someone else? Yeah, Bonnie, go ahead.
For me, my husband and I like history, so we love going to the East Coast and going to a lot of historical buildings. And when you go to a place where something's occurred, like the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and and even since we've been there, how many dignitaries, how many funerals have been there? St. Patrick's in New York. We went to, I think it's Christ Church in Richmond, Virginia, where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Knowing that certain people were there, significant people, or certain events occurred, it takes a whole different meaning than if you just walk into that church. Oh, this is where Patrick Henry was. Oh, this is where so-and-so was. You go to Boston, you've been in Boston. I mean, I just love Boston. Or you go to like Independence Hall in Philadelphia, any of those places where, forefathers were and where events happened and so on and so forth. That just gives a whole other meaning. I'm standing in the place where this happened hundreds of years ago.
Yes. That is its own magnificence. You can't go to Gettysburg and not feel what you're just saying. There are some fairly ornate structures there, like the cyclorama at Gettysburg, but just to be at a place like Gettysburg where so much happened that's pivotal to who we are as a nation, to our identity, that yes, you feel that when you're in these places. Some of that is just, there's design there, but some of that, like you say, is just because of the story of what happened there. And I do think a lot of the churches, even in Europe, have claim to some of those stories too. Oh, this is where this particular saint or prophet or someone, kind of was their home ground. This is where they did, they stepped into their identity as a leader, as a prophet, that kind of thing. So a lot of our churches kind of pick up on those stories too, and then bloom in their own ways with their own kind of continuation of that story. But I do think it's just valuable to pay attention to where you see those places of design, of inspiration, and of meaning through structure and through place in our society. Okay, I'd like to finish up with this this kind of idea of, when it struck me as I was reading it, that it only took 2 years for them to reach the outskirts of the promised land, and they always call that the land of milk and honey. And to me, what makes why milk and honey, they're nourishing, but they're also those things that represent when we have a place that's our own. Bees, you have to kind of have a stable place for bees to make honey, unless it's just natural. But, I think we're talking about that when you cultivate, when you can create that. So there's an element that they're both nourishing foods, but they're also representative of when we have a place to call our own, this is what it will be like. That's the dream, that's the vision. But it's so remarkable that they get so close. And the way the story goes is the scouts go in, they say, oh my gosh, it is a land full of milk and honey, but there's also a bunch of fortified cities. And the people go, maybe we shouldn't go in. And so the story goes, God reacts to that and says, sorry, no, that type of lack of trust, that type of fear is not to be rewarded. So you're going to have to sit here for multiple generations. No one who is over the age of 20 is going to get in, kind of thing, that sort of thing. But I don't know that that's specifically punishment necessarily. I just think there's something about human nature here. And I wanted to ask you, as we see their response to what is just being so close to their promised land. In your own experience, what are some of the things that might prevent you or have prevented you from entering your own promised lands of, say, a more fulfilling life? What are some of the things that have stopped you? They were right there. And it's like they could have gone in, and yet maybe they couldn't have. Maybe they needed that time. Okay? It brings us back to this wilderness experience. It's so important to not rush into the next thing, but let it teach us. And sometimes it's not easy. Just want to hear from you. What are some of the things that you've noticed have gotten in the way from your stepping into your own, or that have stalled you maybe in stepping into your own version of the promised land, your own fulfilling life? Anything come up? Marcia?
Fear of losing control. I'm used to what I have known and not sure if.
That is such a huge one, isn't it? I really feel like that's at the root of a lot of the complaint. When the people want to go back to Egypt, it's not because they want to go back to being slaves, but they want to go back to what's controllable and known. They knew that they could get more than enough. They never lacked for food there. They just weren't free. And so they were willing to go back to what felt safe and controlled, as opposed to this foray into the wilderness. And I think that is absolutely something that we all face as we enter our own wilderness. That fear of the unknown and the desire to have more control. Because let's face it, most of our lives feel out of control, and we spend a lot of our time seeking to wrest control from in places where it's not always easy. And we often want to find control in places that are simply not controllable. That's one of the reasons why we have religion. Truly, it helps put something out of our control onto someone that has ultimate control. And it helps us feel a sense of place and direction and hope. Okay. Other reflections on those places in your life that have been just harder, that have sort of interrupted your ability to step into your own promised land, your own sense of a fulfilling life. I think a lot of us struggle to figure out who we are, who we really are, and to trust that, or we define ourselves and we say, well, I'm this and not that. I'm not a singer. I'm not a dancer. I don't do that. I don't speak that way. That sort of thing. Heck, we saw Moses do it the whole time. And yet his trust, his faith sort of outweighed the fear. It wasn't that he wasn't afraid. We're all going to deal with fear. And that's really what it comes down to. It's always about fear of something, fear of loss of something, fear of gaining of something. But that's what interrupts us. That's what interrupts our ability is, and then the degree to which we can just have more trust. Say, all right, I'm afraid, but I trust more, and that's enough to take that step and stop setting limits on ourselves where maybe God sees something bigger, or that the Jethro, whoever that is for us, that wise person that advises us, who sees us, and to allow them to see us, to hear that and say, all right, okay, I don't know if I'm fully there yet, but I trust enough to take that next step. That's promised land right there. That's promised land. Again, it's less destination, it's more movement towards. Anything coming up? Anything else that just any reflections on that? This idea of promised land. We think of it as a place, and the stories of Joshua and really convey this sense of promised land as literal geography. but really there's so much more to it. And our ability to step into the places of promise in our lives require so much preparation. And the wilderness, the complaining, the doubting, all of that is, it's material in the soil that I feel doesn't always, but it can lead to the healthiest harvest. You know, sometimes we judge ourselves when we feel like we haven't arrived where we want to be, or whatever the promised land is for us. Maybe that's part of our stepping into the promised land: less judgment, less self, less tearing ourselves down, and more saying, all right, this is all part of the deal. It's all part of my learning, my journey, and stay with that so that we don't get stuck. Because if we start pointing fingers too much at ourselves, that's when I think we get stuck in those places. And, like what Marcia and like several of you have been saying, there's no movement. There's the growth. It's harder for the growth to happen. And it ends up just being a cycle of complaint. But really the patterns and the rhythms of this whole journey through wilderness is such a great descriptor of movement into wisdom and learning in our lives. Okay. And all of it is valuable. There's not one part here that's like, oh gosh, I can't believe they did that. That's not what, we're not intended to look at these stories and be like, oh, they were so dumb there. Oh, I can't believe they did that. How dare, no, all of this is a mirror. These are mirror stories, and we need to be able to see them that way, and maybe with a little humor, and then seeing ourselves a little more lightly, so that we don't get into that place of judgment. Otherwise, I feel like we miss a lot of the opportunity there. I could keep talking for a long time. Any other just reflections on this today, the whole idea of wilderness, just this and movement towards the promised land, the places of milk, of honey, of growth, of fulfillment. Ken, and then Bonnie.
Well, I'll share a story. I grew up in Oregon, and just loved the West Coast. And somehow when I accepted a call to the ministry, I communicated to God, I'll go wherever you want me to go, but I'm not going to the Midwest. I want to stay on the West Coast. And it was going to be either Oregon or maybe California. After I went to seminary down here, California was pretty nice. Washington was a possibility, but I was not going to go to the Midwest. But the circumstances in my life changed, and at one point I had to say, God, I'll go wherever you want me to go. That's going to be the place that you need me to be.
Yeah.
And I ended up about as Midwest as you could be in Nebraska. and turned out loving it.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And I relate to so much of what you just said. My journey in ministry I've ended up, just the fact that I'm a minister at a church was not at all what I sought when I started seminary. I wanted to be a chaplain. I didn't want to preach every week. I didn't want to deal with people's problems. I felt like people in a chaplaincy or in a hospice, it was perfect. I had to deal with one thing, the end of life chapter. I could focus on that. That's what I thought. These are some of the things that just honestly going through my head. And then in the end, it broke me down and it broke me open. And I love what I get to do. Yeah, it's incredibly challenging, but I still get to do a lot of those things that I loved about chaplaincy, but it's so much richer, so much more. And so, loving it for that, even while feeling often ill-equipped for what is asked. But then that's the opportunity to then, as a leader of a church, to step into that vision of shared leadership that we talked about, and how I do that and encourage and equip others to help me where I feel less equipped. But this is all what it's about today. Was it Bonnie that had another comment? I think you had your hand up.
I did, but I think I kind of forgot what I was going to say. But but I think it had something to do with materialism and not feeling that to be fulfilled you have to reach a certain level of a certain financial level and a certain level of material desires. I don't know. I can't remember now
Acquiring or
exactly what I
accomplishment.
was thinking,
Yeah.
but it was along that line.
That's a hard one because that narrative is so pounded into us on many, it's all around us all the time. And so having these places like a church where we can communicate other values, other definitions for a fulfilled life are incredibly important. And that's where, that's why you have the creation of a place like a tent of meeting, because it sets it apart. Okay, the wills and ways of the world are out there. And so in here, this is where we focus. This is what is meaningful. That's the intention. We're not trying to separate for all time, but to create these spaces that sort of seal us off from all this other noise is so important. It's so important to have us, to have a chance to take hold in us. Otherwise, it's very difficult to kind of operate free of a lot of those noises, of those voices inside of us.
There's such a, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but it's sort of ingrained that we climb the ladder. You climb the professional ladder. You start out somewhere near the bottom, but it's expected. I mean, when I was in the military, they always said up or out. You
Yep.
couldn't stay at a low-ranking officer or low-ranking enlisted person. You had to keep moving up, or else you were out. And that's kind of true, throughout life. It's sort of true, like, well, you start out with your starter home, but then you're supposed to grow and eventually have your dream home before you die. And if you never get your dream home, which I'm never going to have my dream home, it's like, well, you just didn't quite make it. You kind of made the wrong choices somewhere.
Right. And this is an important lesson, because even that narrative, which a lot of us look at and recognize at some point in our lives that is not the ultimate valuation of our lives, but then that allows us to move to that place that I feel like Pete was talking about when he was talking about the times of wilderness and learning what home means, what it means to discover home and where you feel at home in your life and in your heart, to deepen that. But it often has to happen through the trial and error of that other narrative. So again, that's part of the wilderness journey. It's to allow it all to happen, but like you're saying, keep growing. Don't get stuck, or don't get too comfortable in saying, "Oh, well, I've arrived." As soon as we say that, it's often that's the surefire way to have something start falling apart. Because we realize that the truth is, we're always growing, we're always moving, we're always wandering. Okay, so let's aim to do that with intention. In our individual lives, and for myself as a leader of a church, I hope to continually shape that spirit and that identity in our church, that we have a shared sort of vision. What are we walking toward? These last couple of years have been a bit of a whoa, where are we? It's just the truth. As we get older, that happens in our physical individual lives, but just when things happen in the world, they rock us. Hey, sometimes by being rocked, we're actually settling in and getting stronger, that sort of thing. But sometimes it does create some places that need to be shored up. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. That's part of our promised land. Where are we moving toward? What is calling us? What is life giving? What is fulfilling in our identity, in our way of being in the world? That's the intention. It's an intention in our worship, in our board structure, in classes like this. These conversations, they're seed planting. And it's a chance for us to go out now and look, oh, I get to notice, I get to wonder about how things that I experience every day in my life help to inform my growth, my perception, my ability to connect dots and to see my life not as a series of compartments, but as one flowing continuum. Any other comments? I know it's kind of been a bit of a wide-ranging conversation. When you talk about wilderness, there's a lot of places you can go. But as we've covered the material for today, anything left that you had a question about, or any other comments? Margaret, I want to thank you for hanging in there. I can
I'm just
imagine.
going
This
to
is long.
say,
Yeah.
the paint pill is wearing off, so I better go.
Well, we're just about done. I will say this.
I've enjoyed it. I missed it. And I'm sorry I missed so many sessions, but I'm grateful for what I've got.
And that's
Thank
how we feel. We are grateful that you're here now. We're grateful that all of you are here now. And next week, it will be its own thing. So I hope to see many or all of you or others too. Next week, it'll be the last session of this, and then we'll take a break for the summer. But it's the readings are Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-7, and then 20-25, and then Deuteronomy 8, verses 12-14, and 17-18. It's all in that sheet that I handed out at the beginning, and the material is also posted on the church website. So thank you all, as always. Oh, did you have a question, Carol?
I was just going to say, we'll miss you guys. We're leaving next Tuesday, headed for Ohio. So we'll miss the last session, but look forward to the recording.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, everyone, be well. Thank you for your wonderful contributions today. And I look forward to finishing this last next week. Now the rushing waters.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.